It was the 24th of December, and London lay under a thin, sullen frost. The bells of Street Mary-le-Beau tolled through a fog so thick it seemed to drink the sound rather than carry it. In Baker Street, a fire roared in our grate, and Holmes, wrapped in his old dressing-gown, sat cross-legged upon the hearth-rug like some lean-featured idol contemplating smoke rather than incense. I had scarcely turned the final page of the Times when a violent rattling at the street door interrupted our quiet. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a gentleman of military bearing, his moustache bristling with frost, his manner urgent and disordered. "Holmes," he began, "there has been a sort of murder at the Royal Albion Club. They've sent for the yard, of course. But good Lord, sir, it's Christmas Eve, and every inspector worth his salt is either at home or in the taverns. I was told nay, commanded to fetch you." Holmes rose, the languor evaporating at once. "Pray compose yourself, Colonel." He motioned the man to the armchair. "The Royal Albion, you say? A rather exclusive establishment. What has occurred that requires such secrecy?" The Colonel swallowed. "A man was found dead in his locked chamber, sir. His door bolted from within, windows fastened, the fire low, no sign of forced entry. A single set of footprints in the fresh snow leading to his door, none leading away. And to make matters worse," his voice faltered, "it is Sir Basil Montcrieff. I recognize the name, an industrial magnate of formidable repute, known for both philanthropy and controversy, especially regarding a disputed patent case that had ruined several rivals." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "A locked room on Christmas Eve, delicious. Pray continue." "The oddest part, Mr. Holmes," said the Colonel, "is that Sir Basil's body was found seated before the hearth, his hand upon a brandy glass, as though asleep. Yet the doctor swears he died not of poison, nor any wound, but of well he cannot say. There's a look upon the face, though, one I shall never forget." Holmes steepled his fingers. "A look, you say? Describe it." "Fear, sir. Utter, frozen terror, as though he had seen something no man ought to." For a moment, the crackle of the fire was the only sound. Then Holmes said softly, "Watson, the case presents itself as a gift from Providence, or perhaps from something less benevolent. Fetch your coat. We go to the Royal Albion." And so, on that bitter Christmas Eve, while most of London sought warmth and revelry, we stepped once more into the fog, following a trail that began in snow and would end, as so many of Holmes's trails did, in mystery. The cab wheels hissed upon the slush as we turned from Baker Street into the dim artery of Pall Mall. A low fog clung to the lamps, wreathing each one in a halo that flickered and died as we passed. Holmes, buried in thought, leaned forward with that peculiar intensity that meant his mind was already several moves ahead of us. I knew better than to interrupt him. Only once did he speak, and it was almost to himself. "Fear, Watson, true, unmanufactured fear. It leaves its trace as surely as ink upon paper. If Sir Basil died of nothing that can be named, then it is not the weapon we must seek, but the cause of the terror that wielded it." When we arrived, the Royal Albion Club stood like a fortress of silence amid the festive tumult of the Strand. Its windows glowed faintly, yet behind those curtains the mood was heavy as lead. A liveried porter led us to the second floor, where Colonel Fitzroy waited before a locked chamber. His face was drawn, and he gestured with subdued dread. "The yard's man, Inspector Morton, is inside. You'll find him a sensible fellow, though quite at his wit's end." Holmes gave a curt nod and entered. The air was close and faintly acrid, as if something had burned beyond sight. Sir Basil Montcrieff sat slumped in an armchair before the dying embers. His head tilted slightly back, eyes open and glassy. His hand still clutched a crystal tumbler, the liquid within scarcely touched. A faint smile. No, not a smile, something twisted between disbelief and horror, lingered on his lips. Holmes crouched low before the body, examining it with those hawk-like eyes that missed nothing. "Watson," he said quietly, "note the discoloration about the temples. It is neither bruising nor frostbite. Curious. And look here, no sign of struggle, no spilt brandy, no disarray of furniture. Death came to him quietly, but not kindly." Inspector Morton, a ruddy-faced man with honest eyes, straightened from where he had been studying a notepad. "No marks on the body, sir. Dr. Hardy swears there's no wound or trace of poison. The room was locked from within, key still in the door, window fastened, no hidden passage. And those footprints outside, just one set, the servant who brought his nightcap." "Which servant?" Holmes asked, without turning. "James Cutter, his man of 20 years. He found the body at dawn." Holmes's gaze moved to the mantelpiece, where a clock ticked faintly. It stopped at precisely 1:30. When was he last seen alive? 10:30, Morton replied. "He came in from a private dinner downstairs and retired here alone. No visitors afterward, or so we think." Untouched. Yet he sat here for hours. "Tell me, Colonel, what of Sir Basil's affairs? Any quarrels? Debts? Shadows upon his name?" Fitzroy hesitated. "Well, he had enemies, naturally. 2 former partners sued him for patent theft, though both suits collapsed. There were whispers of threats, anonymous letters, but the man scoffed at them, said no one would dare touch him." "On the contrary," Holmes murmured, "men who believe themselves untouchable are most often the first to be struck." He then rose abruptly, pacing once around the room, eyes grazing every corner. The faint scorch upon the hearthstone, a peculiar ash-gray residue near the grate, a discarded paper knife whose edge gleamed dully in the firelight. He paused before a gilt-framed painting of a hunting party, finger tracing the dust along its lower edge. Something made him smile, a rare, fleeting expression of delight. "Watson," he said, "our ghost may have left footprints after all, though not in snow. There is more here than death and fear. There is conversation, a silent exchange between man and memory." He turned toward the window, where frost traced delicate filigree across the glass. "We shall call upon this James Cutter at once. I fancy the good man has seen more than he dares admit. And if he hasn't, well, then the dead will have to speak for themselves." With that, Holmes extinguished the lamp, letting the pale light of dawn creep over the lifeless figure. "Come, Watson. The game begins in earnest." The servant, James Cutter, was a thin, grey-haired man with a nervous tic about the eyes, the sort that twitches not from guilt but from the strain of seeing something the mind cannot reconcile. We found him waiting in a small anteroom off the corridor, hat clasped in his trembling hands. Holmes motioned for him to sit, though the man seemed incapable of stillness. "You were devoted to your master?" Holmes began, his tone as gentle as one might use upon a frightened animal. 30 years, sir. Since before he married, he were a hard man, but fair. Never raised a voice without cause." "You were the one to bring him his nightcap?" "Yes, sir. At 10:30. Brandy and soda, as always. He was by the fire, reading some papers. I set the tray down and wished him good night. He said, 'Thank you, James. That will be all. Nothing more.' And the door? Locked it himself, sir. Always did." Holmes leaned forward. "And in the morning?" Cutter's hands tightened on his hat. "The porter found the door still bolted. No answer when we knocked. We forced it open, and there he was." His voice faltered. "Eyes wide open, sir." As though he'd seen the devil himself. Holmes's expression did not change, but I noticed the faint flicker of curiosity ignite behind his calm exterior. "You have been in his service a long time, Cutter. You must know his habits, his fears, his friends and enemies." "I don't know about fears, sir. He weren't a man to scare easy. But, if you'll pardon me, he'd been uneasy these last few weeks. Kept the curtains drawn even in daylight. Burned letters in the grate, and once, sir, I found him sitting up at 3 in the morning. staring at that painting over the mantel. Wouldn't let me touch it to dust. The hunting scene? Holmes asked quickly. Cutter nodded. Aye, sir. Said it was an heirloom, but he'd bought it only this year from some auction. Never knew why it troubled him so. Holmes glanced at me, a silent message passing between us. That painting again. Then he turned back to the servant. Did he receive any visitors that evening? No one, sir. Only a telegram in the afternoon came by boy from the Strand office. He read it, went pale as chalk, and told me not to mention it. I never saw the paper again. Thank you, Cutter. That will do for now, Holmes said, rising. But as the man turned to leave, Holmes added, One last question. When you entered this morning, was the window frost intact? Cutter frowned, thinking. Yes, sir. It was unbroken, thick as glass. Couldn't have been opened. Holmes nodded, satisfied, and when the door closed behind the servant, he drew a long breath. Watson, our mystery deepens like the fog outside. A painting that must not be touched, a telegram that vanishes, and a corpse without a cause of death. There is method here, though we see only fragments. I could not help remarking, You think the painting has some bearing on the death? My dear Watson, when a man of reason stares at a thing until dawn, there is always bearing. I should like to see it by full daylight, and to know who sold it to him. He moved to the mantel once more, pulling a magnifying lens from his pocket. As the first rays of morning entered the room, they glinted off something at the painting's lower edge, a thin residue like powdered glass. Holmes scraped a little onto his fingertip, sniffed it, then looked sharply at me. Phosphorus, he murmured. Curious. Not enough for poison, but enough for illumination. He straightened, pocketing his lens. Watson, we must pay a visit to the Strand Telegraph Office. If that message remains unrecorded, I shall know it by the absence of its shadow. And afterward, his eyes darted toward the painting. We return here after dark. I suspect Sir Basil's true murderer does not walk by daylight. Without another word, he strode from the room, his coat swirling like smoke behind him. I followed close, chilled less by the winter air than by the thought that, for once, even Sherlock Holmes did not entirely trust what he saw. The Strand lay half submerged in mist when we reached the telegraph office, a dreary stone building whose windows threw pale squares of light onto the cobbles. Inside, the air smelled faintly of ozone and ink. Holmes presented his card to the clerk, a thin man with a watch chain as bright as his suspicion. My colleague and I are assisting the authorities, Holmes said with practiced ease. We wish to know whether any telegrams were dispatched yesterday to Sir Basil Montcrief at the Royal Albion Club. The clerk hesitated. I'd have to check the register, sir. Pray do, Holmes replied, and as the man disappeared into the back room, he turned to me. The telegram is a hinge. Watson, either it opens the door to motive or closes it entirely. A man does not pale at trifles. A few minutes later, the clerk returned with a ledger and an uneasy look. There was indeed a message, sir. Arrived at 1:45 in the afternoon. But, he tapped the page, frowning. It was marked confidential, deliver by hand only. No copy retained. Signed simply with the letter V. I remember it, because Sir Basil's butler tipped the boy £0.50 for haste. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Well, an initial meant to conceal more than reveal. Curious. He thanked the clerk and, once outside, said quietly, You recall, Watson, the patent case mentioned by the Colonel Montcrief versus Vardane Industries? Indeed. You think the V stands for Vardane? Possibly. Montcrief's victory ruined a man named Victor Vardane, an inventor of some talent and less conscience. He vanished from London soon after the trial, a vindictive fellow, if memory serves. Holmes hailed a cab. To Westminster, he told the driver, and we were soon rolling toward the fog-dimmed outlines of the old industrial quarter. The hansom rattled through the narrow streets, past shuttered workshops and chimneys that bled faint smoke even on Christmas Eve. We stopped before a grim warehouse with boarded windows. A brass plate, green with age, still bore the name Vardane and Co. Experimental engineering. Holmes tested the door. It yielded with a reluctant groan. Inside, dust lay thick over the benches, but a faint footprint marred the surface near the rear stairs. Holmes bent low, studying it by the flicker of his match. "Recent," he whispered, "and heavy, someone carrying weight or burden." The toes point outward. An anxious gait. We climbed carefully to the upper floor. There, amid half-covered machinery, stood a table cluttered with electrical coils, copper wires, and a large framed canvas. The sight stopped me short. It was the same painting that had hung over Montcrief's mantel, the hunting party in the misty wood, save that this one was partially dismantled, revealing a network of wires and tiny filaments hidden behind the canvas. Holmes examined it in silence, then murmured, "So our heirloom was no heirloom at all, an instrument of design. Watson, one meant not to please the eye, but to transmit." Before I could question him further, footsteps echoed from below. Holmes motioned for silence and drew me into the shadow of a great engine. The steps grew louder, accompanied by the metallic clink of a lantern. A figure appeared, a tall man in a heavy coat, carrying a parcel wrapped in oilcloth. He approached the table, set the bundle down, and began unwinding wires with quick, deliberate fingers. Holmes leaned close to my ear. "Observe his right hand burned scar upon the knuckles. Victor Vardane, beyond doubt." We watched as the man adjusted the wiring within the false painting, muttering to himself. He thought he could hide from me. "Make me the fool." His voice trembled between rage and despair. But he heard it, didn't he? He heard the sound before it killed him. Holmes's breath touched my shoulder. "Watson," he whispered, "we have just discovered the weapon. Not a blade or bullet, but sound itself." Before I could reply, Vardane turned sharply, lantern swinging. For an instant his eyes met ours across the gloom, and he froze, the color draining from his face. Then, with a hoarse cry, he snatched a revolver from his pocket. Holmes moved like lightning, striking the lantern from Vardane's hand as it shattered upon the floor. "Watson, cover the door," Holmes barked. But Vardane did not flee. He stumbled backward, eyes wild, toward the painting. "You don't understand," he cried. "It was meant for justice, not death." And before either of us could stop him, he tore away the cloth and seized the exposed wires. The air filled with a strange hum, rising higher, sharper until it became unbearable. I clapped my hands to my ears, but the sound pierced, on bone and thought alike. When it ceased, Vardane lay crumpled at the base of the frame, still and silent. Holmes stood motionless for a long moment, then said softly, "The second corpse of the same weapon. The case has turned upon itself, Watson. Now we must discover why Montcrief heard death before Vardane could explain it." For a moment neither of us spoke. The warehouse seemed to breathe a slow, hollow exhalation through the cracks of its ancient walls. Holmes knelt beside the body, his face half lit by the dying flicker of the broken lantern. "Dead," he murmured. "Instantaneous. The current must have passed through the auditory nerve precisely the same manner as Montcrief. He perfected his own executioner." I crouched beside him, studying the man's still features. There was no visible wound, only that same terrible rigidity, the faint distortion about the mouth that mirrored the expression I had seen upon Montcrief's lifeless face. Holmes's gaze wandered to the shattered mechanism. "Observe, Watson. The wires lead to a small induction coil and resonating disc, concealed behind the canvas. It is not art, but acoustics. When charged, it emits a frequency just beyond the human threshold, intolerable, perhaps even fatal, when directed at close quarters." "You mean he killed with sound?" I asked incredulously. "Not sound as you know it, vibration, compressed into a singular pulse. I have read of such experiments. Vardane may have refined them. Montcrief must have purchased this contraption under false pretenses, believing it an artwork or a gift, and never realized its true nature, until it was too late. Holmes drew a thin steel probe from his pocket and delicately adjusted the coil. Yes, see here, there is a hidden switch in the frame's corner. Touching it completes the circuit. He hesitated, then added grimly, "One wonders whether Montcrief touched it himself or whether another hand ensured he did." He rose, dusting off his knees, his eyes bright with thought. Vardane's words before he died, "It was meant for justice, not death," suggest an unintended consequence. Perhaps the device was meant to frighten, to render its victim helpless, not to kill. Yet revenge seldom restrains its own hand. I shivered. Then Montcrief's fear may have been genuine, a man watching his own judgment unfold. Precisely. And yet, Holmes's brows knit. Why deliver it through the subterfuge of art? Why send a telegram marked confidential? Unless, Watson, there it lies, the key within the contradiction. Vardane's invention may have required a specific condition to function, one that Montcrief alone could provide. He began pacing the room in swift, restless strides, speaking more to himself than to me. An electrical field, a resonance chamber, or perhaps... He stopped abruptly. "Come. We must return to the Royal Albion immediately. The answer, I think, still hangs above that cold hearth." The cab ride back passed in tense silence. Outside, the fog had thickened to an almost solid wall. Even the gaslights appeared as dim orange ghosts. At the club, the servants had long since retired, and Inspector Morton, still keeping vigil over the crime scene, looked up in astonishment as we entered. "Another death, Inspector?" Holmes said curtly. "Vardane himself by his own device. But do not trouble the yard yet. There is one last matter to settle." He strode to the fireplace, lifted the painting from the wall, and laid it face down upon the carpet. With a thin blade, he pried open the rear panel, revealing the hidden apparatus within. Morton let out a low whistle. "By heaven, what devil's work is that?" Holmes bent closer. "Note the faint residue here. Along the frame's edge, the same phosphoric dust I found before. It forms a fine line, almost invisible to the naked eye. That, Inspector, is our trigger, chemical filament sensitive to heat. When the fire burned low, the warmth along the mantelpiece was sufficient to activate the mechanism. Montcrief did not touch the switch. The room itself did." I stared, speechless. Then his own habits doomed him sitting close to the hearth, brandy in hand. Holmes nodded gravely. "A poetic symmetry, Watson. Vardane sought to punish the man who stole his invention. The weapon was meant to frighten, to force confession, but instead it killed him, and when remorse came, it killed its maker as well." He replaced the frame gently against the wall, as though sealing away the story's last breath. "Come," he said quietly, drawing on his gloves. "Let us leave the dead to their silence. There is nothing more to be done tonight." As we stepped once more into the fog, the bells of midnight sounded from afar, mingling with the faint crackle of frost beneath our boots. Holmes did not speak again until we reached the waiting cab. Then, staring into the darkness, he murmured, "An invention meant to expose guilt, and it revealed only the frailty of men. Truly, Watson, there are nights when even I must admit that explanation offers no comfort at all." The following morning found us once again in Baker Street, the fire restored to life, and the December light crawling dimly through the curtains. Holmes sat in his armchair, still in the same clothes as the night before, his long fingers clasped beneath his chin, and his gaze fixed not upon the hearth, but upon some distant horizon only he could see. I had spent half the night drafting my notes for the yard, yet the events refused to rest in orderly sequence within my mind. 2 men dead, no weapon in the ordinary sense, and a mystery that seemed to close upon itself like a serpent eating its tail. Holmes had scarcely spoken since dawn, save for one murmured observation about the peculiar properties of sound waves in closed chambers. When at last he stirred, it was with the sudden precision of a man who has drawn a conclusion and finds its shape both irresistible and grim. "Watson, he said quietly. The case is concluded in form, but not in essence. What remains is not a matter of law, but of truth. And the truth, I fear, may yet lie beyond the reach of the Yard's comfortable categories. I looked up from my writing. You mean to say that Moncrief's death was accidental after all? He shook his head. No accident, though perhaps not murder either. Consider, Watson, the device required proximity, stillness, and warmth to activate. Only Moncrief's habitual position before the hearth provided those conditions, yet it was Vardane who designed it. And he who sent it disguised as a painting. Whether remorse or revenge guided his hand is another question. He rose and moved to the window, where the morning fog still clung to the glass in slow, melting beads. But there is something else, something that has disturbed me more deeply than either man's fate. You recall the expression upon Moncrief's face? I shall not easily forget it, I admitted. Holmes turned, his eyes strangely distant. Terror. Yes, but of what? The effect of the vibration upon the nervous system could produce agony, even paralysis. But fear such as that. He broke off. No, Watson. He saw something. Something that existed for no more than a moment, and that moment killed him. You speak in riddles, Holmes. What could he have seen in an empty room? Holmes's voice lowered. Not an empty room, a room alive with frequency. Imagine the sound made visible, the air trembling at such speed that form itself flickers into illusion. There are cases, rare, but documented, where certain vibrations produce what the mind interprets as light or movement. Perhaps Moncrief, in those final seconds, witnessed the ghost of his own guilt shaped by the machine he had wronged its maker with. A knock at the door spared me from answering. Mrs. Hudson entered with the Morning Post, among which lay a single envelope bearing the seal of the Royal Society. Holmes tore it open and scanned the brief note. His brow furrowed. Ha! Confirmation. Vardane had indeed applied for patent recognition 3 years ago, his submission withdrawn at Moncrief's insistence. And here, at the bottom, a curious postscript. Vardane's final correspondence to the Society was returned undelivered last week, marked from the Royal Albion Club. The club? I exclaimed. Then he was there recently? Evidently, and perhaps more than once. Holmes paced the floor, eyes brightening. He may have adjusted the device after its delivery, or left behind something further. We must go back, Watson, this time in daylight and solitude. I cannot rest while even a shadow of doubt lingers. Within the hour, we were again at the club. The corridors echoed with the muffled tread of servants and the faint clink of china from the breakfast room. Inspector Morton, having concluded his formalities, granted us leave to re-examine the scene. The chamber looked smaller in the daylight, less haunted, and yet no less tragic. Holmes moved directly to the fireplace, running his fingers along the soot-blackened brick. Here, he said softly, drawing out a small, folded paper wedged behind the iron grate. It was scorched at the edges, the ink blurred by heat but still legible. He unfolded it with care, his eyes flicking rapidly across the lines. Then he handed it to me without a word. In shaky handwriting, the note read, "To whoever finds this, tell him I forgive him. I heard the sound last night, and it spoke his name." I looked up, unsettled. Whose name? Holmes. Vardane's. Holmes's face was unreadable. No, Watson. He names no man. And yet, in its silence, it names them both. He slipped the paper into his pocket, his expression softened by something near melancholy. We shall tell the Yard what it needs to know. But for us, my dear friend, the rest belongs to the quiet ledger of human folly, where invention meets guilt, and neither survives the sound of its own making. Outside, the church bells began to toll once more, echoes folding into fog. And I knew that, though the case was finished, Sherlock Holmes had found no triumph in its solving, only a faint and lingering unease, as though something unseen still vibrated in the air, waiting to be heard. Holmes stood in the doorway for some moments after we left that room, the folded paper still resting between his fingers. The silence that settled about him was not his usual meditative calm, but something darker, more inward. I had seen him thus only a handful of times, when the solution of a case illuminated not the brilliance of his mind, but the frailty of the world it uncovered. Outside, the day had grown pale and brittle. Frost edged the railings of Pall Mall, and a light sleet began to fall, whispering against the carriage lamps. As we descended the club steps, Holmes suddenly stopped and turned back toward the entrance. "Watson," he said, his voice measured but low, "there is one more thread that I cannot leave untied. Sir Basil's accounts, his financial records. I should like to know if there were any payments or debts between him and Vardane that escaped public notice." "You believe he bought the invention outright?" "I believe he stole it, but cloaked the theft in legality," Holmes replied. "A transaction that ruined one man and made another rich often leaves a paper trail, a ghostly arithmetic of guilt." He hailed a cab, and we rode to Moncrief's residence in Belgravia, where his executor, a shrewd and mournful solicitor named Eustace Halley, received us amid stacks of sealed ledgers and correspondence. The drawing-room, once the domain of opulence, was now half shrouded with dust sheets, the echoes of its owner's downfall still palpable in the hush. Holmes wasted no time in explanation. "I require a list of all private disbursements made by Sir Basil during the past 6 months, particularly those paid in cash or through intermediaries." Halley hesitated. "That is most irregular, Mr. Holmes. These matters concern his cause of death," Holmes interrupted gently but firmly, "and if my suspicions are correct, they may prevent another." Within minutes, the solicitor produced a volume bound in green morocco. Holmes bent over it, scanning the columns of figures with the ease of a man reading a cipher. Then his hand stopped. "Here," Watson observed, "payment of £200 to a Mr. P. Lavington, listed as consultation fee. And another for 75 to an address in the East India Docks, a workshop registered briefly under Vardane's name. A link forged and disguised under false pretext." Halley frowned. "Lavington, you say? Why, he was an acoustical engineer, a member of the Royal Society, until his expulsion for unsanctioned experiments. I recall that he and Vardane corresponded for years." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Precisely. The invention was not Vardane's alone. There was collaboration, then betrayal." He closed the ledger softly, his mind clearly racing ahead. "Watson, I must see this Lavington. If he is alive, he can confirm how the device functioned, and perhaps why both men fell victim to it. Do you recall the note Moncrief left? I heard the sound, and it spoke his name. I must know whether that was madness or design." We found Lavington that evening in a narrow lodging-house near Limehouse. He was a frail, stooped figure, his hair like wisps of grey fog, his hands stained with chemical burns. When Holmes introduced himself, the old man's eyes flickered with wariness. "Vardane is dead, then?" he said at last, in a rasping whisper. Holmes inclined his head. "By his own hand or by the thing he made? You helped him create it?" Lavington gave a weak, bitter laugh. "Helped? No, sir," I warned him. "It was never meant to leave the laboratory. The resonance was unstable, dangerous. We had seen it induce hallucinations in test animals, drive them into panic before death. But Vardane was convinced it could do more, that it could reach the mind directly, expose what a man feared most. He said fear was truth made audible." Holmes leaned forward. "And Moncrief? He came to us as patron, promising funding. But once the prototype succeeded, he forced Vardane to sign over the rights. I left them both to their folly." Lavington's gaze drifted toward the window, where rain streaked the glass. "I told them the machine didn't merely kill," it remembered. "The frequencies it created were shaped by the thoughts of its last operator. Every time it was triggered, it replayed the echo of the previous death. What Moncrief heard was Vardane's hatred. And what Vardane heard—" He trailed off, trembling. It was his own guilt answering him. A hush filled the room. Even Holmes seemed arrested by the weight of the old man's words. Then, softly, he said, "The perfect revenge, one that required no witness, a machine that reflects the conscience of its maker." Lavington's head sank into his hands. God forgive us all. When we stepped back into the night, the fog had thickened into a fine, cold rain. Holmes pulled up his collar and spoke as we walked toward the waiting cab. "There are crimes, Watson, which the law cannot classify because they occur not in the world of action, but of invention, where man's reach exceeds his mercy. I think I shall let this one rest." He paused, looking back once at the dim window of Lavington's room. "But I wonder," he added quietly, "when the next man builds something that listens and what it will hear." We rode home through the rain in near silence. Holmes sat pressed against the corner of the cab, his eyes fixed upon the blurred shapes that drifted past the window, his mind, I knew, turning with that relentless precision which never fully yielded, even when a case appeared concluded. The streets gleamed under the lamps like veins of liquid light, and the muffled clip of the horse's hooves seemed to mark the rhythm of his thought. When at last we reached Baker Street, he moved at once to the fire, rekindled it, and stood before it with his hands clasped behind his back. "Watson," he said after a long pause, "you must see now that what we have uncovered goes beyond vengeance or invention. We have witnessed the beginning of a new species of crime, one committed not by blade or bullet, but by the manipulation of perception itself." I removed my damp coat and sat opposite him. "You mean to suggest the device acts upon the mind?" "Upon the mind's mirror," he replied. "It amplifies what lies already within." Lavington's statement was no delusion. If the machine preserved the final mental impression of its victim, then it becomes a kind of phonograph for the soul. Each activation replayed the emotion of death itself. When Montcrieff perished, his terror was recorded. When Vardane tested the apparatus again, he received that echo, his own vengeance reflected back as horror. The cycle is complete. I shuddered. "And yet, Holmes, you speak of it as though it still exists. Surely the device was destroyed when Vardane died." Holmes's eyes flicked toward the small mahogany box on his writing table. "Partially, but not entirely. I brought away what remained of the resonator coil and its core mechanism." "You kept it?" I exclaimed. "For study, Watson, not sentiment. The danger of ignorance far exceeds the danger of knowledge." He opened the box and revealed a small metal cylinder, no larger than a candle holder, its surface dull and scarred by heat. Even in the lamplight, it seemed to hum faintly, as though something within it still remembered sound. Observe the craftsmanship, precision engineering far beyond what either man could afford alone. There must have been a third contributor, someone who understood the subtleties of harmonic resonance. Lavington's mind is spent. Montcrieff and Vardane are dead. So, who completed this? Before I could answer, a sharp knock rattled the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, pale and apologetic. "Beg pardon, sir, but there's a gentleman below says he comes from the Royal Society. Insisted upon seeing you, though it's well past midnight." Holmes straightened. "Show him up." Moments later, a tall man in a dark overcoat entered, his manner composed yet uneasy. He introduced himself as Dr. Elias Fern, Fellow of the Society's Committee on Experimental Physics. "I heard of your inquiry through Inspector Morton," he said, "and when word reached us of Vardane's death, I felt bound to call. He was once my pupil." Holmes gestured for him to sit. "Then perhaps you can enlighten us as to his work." Fern hesitated. What he built was not entirely of his own conception. He adapted it from papers submitted to the Society 5 years ago, an unfinished project by one of our more eccentric members. The design was meant to demonstrate the auditory limits of the human nervous system, but it failed, catastrophically. We sealed the research, struck it from our archives. I was the one who signed that order. "Who was the author?" Holmes asked quietly. The man's voice dropped. "Professor James Moriarty." For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the hiss of the fire. I felt the blood drain from my face. Holmes, however, did not move, his stillness more dreadful than any outburst. "Moriarty," he repeated softly, as if tasting the name upon the air. "Of course. The web stretches wider than we imagined." He turned toward the fire, the faintest tremor of fascination in his tone. Moncrief's greed, Vardane's pride, Lavington's remorse. All of them pawns in an experiment long abandoned, yet still alive in principle. Moriarty was testing the limits not of sound, but of control, the means to turn a man's own mind against him. Fern nodded gravely. "If he learns that someone has reconstructed even part of the device, he will come for it." Holmes replaced the metal cylinder in its box and shut the lid with a decisive click. "Then it will not be here when he does." His eyes met mine, sharp and alight with that peculiar fire which always preceded some audacious plan. "Watson, there is more at stake now than justice for two dead men. We are facing the ghost of an intellect that refuses to die. And I intend to learn precisely what melody Professor Moriarty hoped to conduct." Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air was heavy with the promise of another storm. The night beyond Baker Street seemed to listen, as if the city itself were waiting for the next vibration to begin. The end of Section 8. We rode back toward Baker Street in silence, the cab wheels splashing through the shallow pools of rainwater that glittered beneath the lamps. Holmes sat opposite me, his face partly hidden by shadow, his fingers drumming a slow, deliberate rhythm upon his knee. I had seen that look before, an inward stillness, as though he were listening not to the city around him, but to something that continued to echo inside his mind. When at last he spoke, it was in a tone softer than I expected. "There is no victory here, Watson. What we have uncovered is not a crime of passion or greed, but of intellect, unrestrained by conscience. Vardane and Moncrief were both victims of their own creation, the one who wielded power without understanding, and the other who understood too late what power truly is." He leaned back, eyes closing briefly. "And yet, something still troubles me." Lavington said the device remembered. "Such a statement might be dismissed as the fancy of an old man were it not for the identical expression upon both faces of the dead. Fear, yes, but of something known, recognized. I cannot reconcile that." I hesitated before replying. "You think the machine preserved a pattern of the last emotion it transmitted?" "Perhaps," Holmes murmured. "Perhaps it was not the sound itself that killed, but what the mind made of it. Every man has a secret terror buried within him, a truth he denies even to himself. If Vardane's invention could shape vibration to the mind's frequency—" He broke off, shaking his head. "It would mean that Moncrief heard not a stranger's malice, but his own guilt-given voice. The perfect mirror and the deadliest." When we reached Baker Street, the fog had thickened into a quiet, suffocating shroud. Holmes dismissed the cab and stood for a moment beneath the lamplight, his breath a faint plume in the cold air. "I wonder," he said, "how many men could endure hearing the sound of their own conscience? Come, Watson, we shall write to the Yard in the morning. For tonight, I prefer silence." But silence was not granted us for long. We had scarcely hung our coats when Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram upon a small tray. Holmes tore it open, his eyes scanning the few lines, and his expression hardened. "From Inspector Morton," he said. "The club's night watchman has been found dead." Same expression, same locked room, same absence of cause. I felt a chill that owed nothing to the weather. "Then the device—" "Still active," Holmes finished grimly. "It seems Vardane's mechanism is not as dead as its maker." Within the hour, we were once more en route to the Royal Albion, the cab rocking through the deserted streets. The building loomed like a tomb against the mist. Morton met us at the entrance, pale and shaken. "He was making his rounds," the inspector said. "No one heard a struggle. We found him slumped against the wall outside Moncrief's chamber. Door still locked. No sign of intrusion." Holmes brushed past him without a word. The corridor was eerily still, save for the faint ticking of a clock somewhere down the hall. He approached the door, then paused, nostrils flaring slightly. "Do you smell that, Watson?" I nodded. "Ozone like the aftermath of lightning." Holmes's expression was grim satisfaction. "Residual discharge. The circuit remains incomplete but charged. Vardane's device has been reawakened, perhaps by the same filament we thought extinguished." He knelt beside the door, examining the skirting with his magnifying lens. Here the dust disturbed, faint scuff marks. "Someone else has been here since the room was sealed." He rose slowly. "The club's management, perhaps curiosity, greed, or worse. We are not dealing with one secret now, Watson, but several. The machine's design was known to 3 men, yet one more has tried to claim it." Morton stared. "You mean another death may follow?" Holmes met his gaze evenly. "Unless we act before the night is out." He stepped toward the fire grate, where the cold ashes of the night before still clung to the iron. "Watson, bring me my case. We shall dismantle what remains before it kills again. But if my suspicion is right, someone intends to use it one last time, and we may already be too late." He straightened, his face drawn yet resolute. "This, my dear Watson, is no longer a case of murder. It is an echo that refuses to die." Holmes moved swiftly but with measured precision, as though every second must count. Yet none could be wasted in haste. He closed the door behind us, shutting out the corridor's dim light, and struck a single match to relight the lamp. The flame sputtered, revealing the familiar outlines of the chamber, Sir Basil's chair, the hearth, the painting once again looming over the mantel. Only now the fire had been relit, though no servant had entered since the watchman's death. The coals burned too steadily, too deliberately, as if arranged by a careful hand. Holmes crouched before the grate. "Do you see, Watson? The ashes form a ring. Someone has placed the embers so the heat rises evenly along the mantelpiece. Whoever did this knew the mechanism's trigger. The machine is armed again." The inspector swore under his breath. "Then for God's sake, man, disable it." Holmes's gaze flicked upward. "Not yet. If it has been deliberately reactivated, the culprit must be nearby, watching, waiting for the device to act. To destroy it now might drive him to panic. No, we must let him believe it still functions." He lowered his voice. "Watson, stand by the window. Watch the corridor below. I would wager the man will return to confirm the trap has sprung." The air thickened as the minutes passed. Each tick of the mantel clock seemed unnaturally loud. The glow of the coals shimmered against the frame above the fire, faint motes of dust rising in lazy spirals. Then, without warning, a soft click broke the stillness, followed by a low hum, like the stirring of invisible wings. Holmes's head snapped up. "Back, Watson!" he cried. He lunged toward the hearth, wrenching at the wire hidden behind the frame. Sparks erupted, white and blinding, and a sharp metallic shriek filled the air. The sound was not loud, yet it pierced the senses like a blade through bone. For an instant the walls seemed to waver. My knees gave way. I clutched the edge of the table for balance. Holmes tore the final wire free and hurled the mechanism into the grate. The fire flared a violent blue, then died, leaving only smoke and the reek of ozone. The hum ceased. Silence fell, a silence so complete it felt alive. I staggered forward, ears ringing. "Holmes, are you hurt?" He waved me off impatiently, though his face was pale and damp with sweat. "No matter. The device is finished, but we are not alone." Even as he spoke, a faint creak came from the doorway. Morton turned sharply, revolver raised. In the flickering lamplight stood a man half in shadow, the Royal Albion's manager, Mr. Crewe, his usually composed features drawn and wild. His eyes darted from the destroyed apparatus to Holmes, then to the corpse of the night watchman still covered by a sheet in the corner. "You've ruined it," Crewe hissed, stepping into the light. "Do you know what you've done? That invention could change everything, sound harnessed like lightning. Vardane promised me a fortune if I helped him retrieve it. Holmes regarded him coolly. Fortune, yes, but you saw what it bought your predecessors. Tell me, Mr. Crewe, did you relight that fire? Crewe's mouth twisted. I only meant to test it to see if it worked. You can't understand. It wasn't meant to kill. But it did, Holmes said softly. And had we arrived an hour later, you would have joined them. For a moment the man's defiance faltered. Then, with a sudden motion, he lunged toward the hearth, reaching for the half-melted remains of the device. Morton fired once. The report cracked through the silence. Crewe froze, swayed, and fell heavily to the carpet. Holmes stooped beside him, felt for a pulse, then straightened. He is gone. And, with him, the last man who believed he could master the echo of his own guilt. The inspector stood trembling, the pistol still smoking in his hand. God forgive me, he muttered. Holmes laid a hand on his shoulder. You have spared him a worse fate. The machine was never an invention, it was a confession. Every man who touched it heard the sound he feared most. The rest was inevitability. He turned toward me, his eyes heavy with exhaustion but clear. Let us go, Watson. There is nothing more to hear. Outside, dawn was breaking, the faintest pale gold pushing through the fog. The city lay washed and quiet, as though it too had held its breath through the night. Holmes drew his coat, tight, the wind catching at its edges. Curious, is it not? He said softly. How easily men will build their own ruin, provided it hums sweetly enough. And as we walked toward Baker Street, the last echo of that unnatural sound seemed to fade into the waking murmur of London, leaving only the knowledge that for once, even Holmes himself had heard something he could never fully explain. The first light of morning spilled through the fog as we returned to Baker Street. Pale and uncertain, like a truth half revealed. Holmes did not speak on the journey. He sat hunched in the corner of the cab, the brim of his hat casting his face into shadow, the rhythmic motion of the wheels below us, the only sound. I longed to break the silence to ask what haunted him, but something in his stillness warned me that his mind was tracing the final, fragile threads of the case. When at last we reached our door, he passed inside without removing his coat, moving straight to the hearth where our familiar fire burned. He stood before it, hands clasped behind his back, the light dancing against his gaunt features. For a long while, he said nothing. Then, softly, It is a strange thing, Watson, that knowledge pursued without mercy can become as deadly as ignorance. Montcrieff, Vardane, and now Crewe, all undone by a single principle carried too far. He turned toward me with that sudden intensity I had come to know. Do you not find it remarkable that each man believed himself immune? Vardane thought his intellect would save him, Montcrieff his wealth, Crewe his secrecy, yet each fell, not to chance, but to the one thing none could silence the sound of their own fear. I stirred uneasily. You believe the machine truly held such power, that it remembered, as Lavington claimed? Holmes smiled faintly, though his eyes remained distant. The laws of physics admit no memory in metal or wire, my dear fellow. And yet, he trailed off, staring into the fire. You saw what I saw. The identical terror upon each face, the hum that lingered after the current had ceased. There was something in that sound, a residue of will, perhaps, or guilt. If emotion could leave a mark upon a place, why not upon a vibration? He fell silent again. The clock ticked softly between us, its rhythm oddly comforting after the chaos of the night. I poured him a cup of coffee and set it by his elbow, but he did not move to take it. His gaze had drifted toward the violin resting on its stand near the window. After a moment's hesitation, he took it up and drew the bow lightly across the strings. The note that emerged was low, almost mournful, trembling faintly before fading into the air. Sound, Watson, he said quietly. It begins as pressure in the air, yet it stirs memory, love, even madness. The faintest vibration, properly tuned, can move the soul or shatter it. He lowered the instrument and placed it gently aside. I shall not pursue this matter further. The yard will find its tidy explanations, electrocution, chemical fault, what have you, and the world will rest easier for believing them. But I have seen enough to know that some discoveries lie beyond the reach of deduction. He crossed to the window, pulling aside the curtain just as the sun began to climb over the rooftops of London. The fog is lifting, he murmured. How ordinary it all seems now. Yet a few hours ago, this city held a room where men heard death in the voice of their own creation. A warning, perhaps, that there are harmonies not meant for mortal ears. I said nothing. I knew that tone well. It was the one he used when reason had carried him to the very brink of wonder. The flames crackled softly, and for a moment it seemed that the faintest hum, the same pitch we had heard in the club, whispered through the air. I glanced toward Holmes, but he had already stilled. His eyes were closed, his features calm. Then, almost inaudibly, he spoke. "It is over, Watson. The sound is gone." Yet as I looked into the fire, I thought I saw the coals flicker in rhythm with something unseen, a pulse, a breath, a tremor too faint for any ear but his. And in that instant, I wondered whether the machine truly had been destroyed, or whether, as Holmes himself once said, every echo merely awaits the silence that will let it return. He drew the curtains shut and turned away from the light. "Come, my dear friend," he said in his usual brisk tone, though his voice carried an uncharacteristic softness. "There are simpler puzzles in this world, and I think we have earned one. Mrs. Hudson's breakfast, perhaps?" And as the city awoke beyond the mist, I followed him to the table, my pen already forming the words I knew I would write. The case of the Christmas Eve murder Sherlock couldn't explain.